Welcome to Weaving the Blanket, stories of faith, sacrifice, martyrdom, and emancipation of the Evangelical Methodist Church in Bolivia. This is the controversial Season 3, the Aymara Revolution within the IMB. This is Episode 1, the important historical context for the Aymara eruption within the IMB. I am David Stevenson. Before we begin to understand the Aymara Revolution within the IMB, we need to be clear about the national political situation in Bolivia in the 1960s and 1970s. The 6 to 8 million who lived in Bolivia were approximately 80-85% indigenous, about 5% Criollo, which is Hispanic descendants of the conquistadors, and the rest were mestizo, mixed Hispanic and indigenous blood. Even though there was a supposed democracy dating back to the time of Bolivar, the Criollo managed to stay in complete control of the country. They had 90% of the wealth and 100% of the power. The United Nations Development Programme's Human Development Report for 2002 reported that Bolivia ranked highest in the world in the ratio between the income and consumption of the richest 10% of the population compared to the poorest 10%. The ratio was 168.1 to 1. That means that for every dollar made by the bottom 10% of the population of Bolivia, who were all indigenous campesinos, and the income of the top 10%, who were all Hispanic Criollo, was for every dollar, they got $168.1. The second highest ranked country in the world at that time was Namibia in Africa, which was 25% less. It was 128.8 to 1. That means Bolivia had the highest difference between the rich and the poor of any country in the world. Not India, not the United States, whatever. It was Bolivia. From 1969 to 1982, there was a series of military coups as Bolivia became one of the countries which became a battleground for the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. Despite the U.S. government's history of supporting the 1952 revolution and land distribution, in the late 60s and early 70s, the U.S. supported and encouraged military coups which came from the far right in full opposition of communism and socialism. But occasionally, a military leader would come to power who was a moderate or left-wing dictator who, despite not being fully communist, turned toward Moscow or Cuba for help. The U.S. frequently intervened in Bolivian politics, supporting right-wing military dictators who overthrew democratically elected leftist or populist governments. These right-wing dictatorships allowed U.S. businesses free and unregulated exploitation of Bolivia's natural resources of tin, gold, silver, and other minerals, as long as there was a huge bribe involved, of course. These right-wing governments were also violent supporters of the Catholic Church, often restricting and arresting Protestant Christians and even jailing the Protestants. On August 21st, 1971, Hugo Banzer Suarez, aided by a German ex-Nazi living in Bolivia, overthrew a previous military dictator. Banzer ruled the country for 7 years, in which he promoted and developed the livestock and agricultural industry in Santa Cruz Department, supporting immigrants from Eastern European nations with radical right-wing politics. He even allowed the continuation of the hacienda slavery system in Santa Cruz. It was a very difficult time for the indigenous. Banzerism had a policy of intolerance against the popular and union movements, which were vigorously pursued. Concentration and torture camps were created in Choconcoyo, Achacaya, and other regions. Trade unions, political and religious leaders were exiled. The repressive apparatus organized by Banzer committed numerous crimes, such as the systematic assassination of leftist leaders. They also broke the rights of the civil, social, and political citizenship, and social leaders were persecuted and confined, many of whom have not been found even today. In exchange for these measures, the Banzer government received the support from the United States and other governments, which resulted in the country entering a time of economic stability and growth, which also resulted from other measures such as the rise of the price of tin and hydrocarbons. However, the apparent benefits of international economic support made the country's external debt grow uncontrollably, which was described as unpayable when it reached $6 billion. The best explanation about Bolivian politics during this time that I have found is in the book, quote, Building for the New, unquote, written by Paul McCleary, a former U.S. missionary in the 1960s. McCleary researched U.S. State Department documents, internet sources, and others to document and explain the U.S.-Bolivian political relationships during this time. And he has an intriguing chapter of the relationship and power of German Nazis who moved to Bolivia both before the war and toward the end of the war when it was clear that Germany was losing. He also documents the involvement of these German Nazi Bolivians in various right-wing military coups. You might want to look it up.
Now, all of this is important because in the late 1960s, the IMB had become an indigenous-dominated church. The growing majority of church members were indigenous, and it was the indigenous who suffered the most under these dictators. But since the church was led by the Criollo, Mestizo, and U.S. members and missionaries, the church didn't address these issues. But the church's indigenous majority was growing more and more frustrated and felt that God was calling them to do something about this. Although 80 to 85% of the population of Bolivia was indigenous, every single national organization, whether it's political, economic, social, religious, nonprofit of any kind, was run by Hispanic or Mestizo. Indigenous leadership wasn't allowed. The two exceptions, as I said, was the miners' union and the peasant union. And these leaders were under constant threat of arrest, torture, assassination, and they became sinners for the opposition of Banzerism and the primary supporters of democracy. The IMB was just about to become the third leading advocate for democracy and a third defender of human rights of the indigenous, and often was its spokesperson. And therefore, the IMB became a prime target for oppression by right-wing dictators. The early U.S. Methodist missionaries were under the direct control of the Board of Global Ministries, or later the General Board of Global Ministries in New York. New York decided which missionaries went where and for what purpose. But as early as the 1950s, members and leaders of the U.S. Methodist Church realized that they could not sustain the levels of financial support it was giving to the overseas Methodist churches. The view was growing that these churches needed to become increasingly financially self-supporting, and there was the recognition that if they were responsible for their own funding, they should have greater autonomy. Coinciding with this going on in the United States, in South America in the 1950s, more and more national Methodist districts were developing their own Criollo, Hispanic, and Mestizo pastors. The South American Methodist churches had a kind of a schizophrenic attitude toward the U.S. Methodist Church. On the one hand, they wanted some form of autonomy that would allow them to select their own leadership, their own bishop, and control the day-to-day operations of the church within their own national boundaries. But there was also a fervent desire to remain connected to the main United Methodist Church, perhaps because the South American churches needed the financial support and they wanted the U.S. missionaries who raised a large sum of money for work in those countries. It's also possible that the missionaries and many native pastors believed that they needed that strong North American guiding hand to help them move forward. It appears that the United Methodist Church wanted to continue to play a critical role in guiding these churches. Perhaps it was because GBGM didn't feel these third world churches were trained and educated enough to run their own churches. Perhaps it was because of a racial bias. Perhaps it was simply institutional turf protection. Or perhaps it was a need by GBGM to make sure these churches made, quote, good decisions, unquote, that GBGM would agree with. Consequently, in the 1950s, the United Methodist Church created the Rio de la Plata Annual Conference, or the River of Silver Annual Conference, a reference to Cerro Rico, under the central jurisdiction. The Rio de la Plata Conference was made up of multiple districts based on nationality: Argentina, Peru, Brazil, and Bolivia. It had the authority to elect its own bishop. So there was one bishop for all of South America, and was usually a U.S. missionary. Each of the countries were separate districts and led by a district superintendent chosen by the bishop, and again, for Bolivia at least, it was always a U.S. missionary. This allowed a certain level of autonomy for Methodist churches in these areas. However, they were still under the control and direction of the General Conference of the Methodist Church and the Board of Global Ministries. So in the 1950s, the General Board of Global Ministries was loosening its grip on the day-to-day operations of the South American churches. However, the missionaries were voting members of the Rio de la Plata Conference, but were actually members of their U.S. Methodist churches and conferences, not the Bolivian church. But the fact is that in the Bolivian annual conference, the missionaries and their spouses held a majority of votes in the Bolivian district. And even with the new conference, it was New York who was the missionaries' boss. Most of the time, New York sent additional missionaries at the request of Native Church. But they could also send a new missionary without consulting the local church. And the missionaries had to make reports on their work back to New York, and New York was the one who would evaluate the effectiveness of the missionary and pull them home if they weren't pleased. This situation continued throughout the 1960s, and after 1970, the missionaries worked virtually independently from the IMB bishop and the executive committee. This is still true today, but there's much greater consultation with the local church leadership. However, even within the last decade, I'm aware of at least one U.S. conference which had decided to send a missionary to a South American church for a specific task without consulting the local South American church. The pastor was going through a nasty divorce, and for whatever reason, the cabinet of that U.S. conference thought it was a good idea to make him a missionary to Bolivia. However, about 6 to 8 weeks before the U.S. conference was going to send the pastor, there was a leak from the cabinet, and the South American church found out what was going on. And they immediately called the U.S. conference and politely said, "No, thank you. We don't want a missionary for that purpose." This was and is symbolic of the paternalistic attitude that many U.S. conferences had toward the IMB. Despite GBGM's loosening its control over the day-to-day operations of the South American churches, the truth was that the General Board of Global Ministry had an almost complete monopoly over the major decisions of the Southern churches. They chose which missionaries were sent and where they were sent, and their, quote, employees, unquote, held the majority of votes in those conferences, and GBGM even sometimes backed specific candidates for bishop. And they held the purse strings, with the ability to cut off support at any time. So whether it's intentional or not, GBGM in New York, still in the 1950s and early 60s, still made most of the important decisions.
Paul McCleary, in his book, Building for the New, called this era as the period of, quote, missionary dominance, unquote. McCleary writes, quote, "In using the term missionary dominance, I mean the control of decision-making by the Board of Missions in the United States and the leadership roles played by the missionaries in Bolivia."
In the internal church politics of the United Methodist Church in the early 1960s, the South American churches began clamoring for greater autonomy from the main United Methodist Church. Many of its rules listed in the Book of Discipline, which rules the United Methodist Church, also were simply inappropriate in the South American context. For example, to become a pastor in the United Methodist Church, you must have a university degree before you can even enter a United Methodist seminary. This involves 7 years of university education. It's expensive. It assumes that high school education is available to all, and it assumes that students have funds from their families to pay for their living expenses and all the costs of the schools. The Rio de la Plata Annual Conference of South America did not have the money to pay for the seminary students to attend these schools over a 2 or 3 year period. In addition, all Methodist seminaries in South America at that time were taught mostly in English, thus requiring all seminary students to be fluent in English. The Criollo and Mestizo Methodists who wished to become Methodist pastors found it very, very difficult to meet these standards. High school education was generally acceptable to the young men, but very few women had access to high school education in the 1960s. And most of the South American countries did not have a Methodist seminary. Seminary students from Bolivia and other countries had to move to Costa Rica or to Brazil for their education. The system worked fine for the North Americans and Europeans, but not for the South Americans. In South America, as more and more national Methodist churches began to develop their own Criollo, Hispanic, and Mestizo pastors, there was a strong desire to remain connected to the United Methodist Church because the South American churches needed the financial support and they needed U.S. missionaries to come who raised large sums of money for work in their countries. However, by the 1960s, the growing financial burden on the United Methodist Church from supporting these missionary conferences was becoming an increasing burden on the United Methodist Church as a whole. The North American Methodist Church had begun its great, slow, grinding loss of membership, which continues today. In 1970, the United States Methodist membership was over 10 million. And by 2020, the membership of the United States Methodist Church was under 6.8 million, a loss of nearly 30%. Meanwhile, United Methodist membership in Africa has exploded and now exceeds that of the United States membership and brings the total Methodist membership in the world to over 12 million. But as early as the 1960s, members and leaders saw that the United Methodist Church could not sustain the levels of financial support it was giving to the overseas churches. The general feeling up north was that these churches needed to become increasingly self-supporting. This was also the age of the Southern Hemisphere nations demanding and getting independence from their colonial rulers. And the church needed to become nationalized so it wasn't seen as just another form of colonialism. This all put pressure on the General Conference of the United Methodist Church of 1968, which voted to grant full autonomy to those churches who requested it. This was intended to be an amicable breakup where the South Americans would become autonomous churches in all aspects, but with many cooperative agreements with the U.S. Methodist Church. On November 30th, 1969, in the auditorium of the American Institute of Cochabamba, the IMB took its first steps toward developing a truly autonomous Bolivian Methodist Church by declaring the full independence from the United Methodist Church. It established a new constitution and structure which fit better to the culture of Bolivia. And to add to the historical nature of the conference, the Aymara 7, the first indigenous IMB students graduated from the Seminary of Montero, became ordained pastors. I'll talk more about these 7 later in this podcast. Thus, the Methodist mission was nationalized in the country. And from this unprecedented achievement, the IMB was theoretically completely autonomous and sovereign to select their own authorities, their own structures and lifestyles. But fraternal and cooperation ties with other Christian churches in different parts of the world would remain. And the Bolivian Methodist Church joined the Methodist Evangelical Churches of Latin America, the World Methodist Council, and the World Council Churches, being an autonomous church affiliated with the United Methodist Church. So the Bolivian Annual Conference was technically autonomous in 1969. However, the autonomy and local empowerment of Bolivian Methodism was relative at best. One very, very odd aspect of this so-called autonomy was that U.S. missionaries who served in Bolivia, both the seminary-trained husbands and their wives, were members of the U.S. Methodist Church, not the IMB, yet they were still voting members of the newly supposedly autonomous IEMB General Assembly. And since GBGM in New York hired, moved to other countries, or fired U.S. missionaries, those missionaries naturally tended to follow whatever guidance was sent to them from New York with regards to the restructuring of the IMB. GBM still controlled the largest voting bloc in the IMB, the missionaries and their wives. Now, the wives of missionaries believed they deserved missionary status because they were suffering the trials and difficulties of life overseas and obviously doing all kinds of important ministries and worked as hard or even harder than their husbands. That truth is obvious. But in the United States, wives of pastors do much the same work, move at the whim of the bishop, and serve their local church, often preaching and teaching. Yet there's never been a movement to give wives of pastors a full vote at annual conference. They didn't attend classes at seminary. They aren't ordained. Yet in Bolivia, at least, the wives of the pastor missionaries were given a full vote. The only purpose for that, it seems to me, was to double the voting power of the missionaries versus the native pastors whose wives did not get a vote, and the native lay members of the conference who their wives didn't get a vote. The Bolivian delegates who were there were all Hispanic, mestizo, middle-class pastors or laity. And there were very few indigenous delegates, even though approximately 60% of the church members were indigenous. And the IMB was totally dependent upon the U.S. Methodist Church for financial support. The average income of the average Methodist in Bolivia today is less than $2 a day. That's below the level of extreme poverty as defined by the United Nations. So the church could not be self-supporting in the normal way. And the IMB was totally dependent upon the U.S. Methodist Church for financial support. This came in two forms. A generous grant from the General Board of Global Ministries, which paid for the salaries of the pastors, and then there was the money raised by the U.S. Methodist conferences and churches and individuals and by the U.S. missionaries to fund specific projects like schools and hospitals and church construction, etc. And the U.S. continued to have the attitude of what Delfín Quispe called firm paternalism in his book, Historia de la Iglesia Evangélica Metodista en Bolivia, 1906-2006, Una Iglesia Evangélica Enculturada.
Okay, with all that apologetic stuff and all the historical background done, next week we will finally begin telling the story of the Aymara eruption, and we'll begin by telling about the early life of one of the Aymara Methodist pastors who was smack dab in the middle of the Aymara Revolution within the IMB. He was one of its organizers and promoters, Pastor Felipe Salcedo, and you'll begin to understand the frustrations felt by the indigenous Methodists, both lay and clergy, as they were continually denied access to the leadership of the IMB, even though the IMB was quickly becoming primarily an indigenous Methodist church. I hope you will join me next week as I tell you about the early life of Pastor Felipe, about his parents' life as miners in the gold and silver mines, and of his family's conversion to Protestantism. See you next week.